Welcome to Sinister States.
I didn't notice the discrepancy the first time I moved in. Nobody ever does. Buildings like this rely on that. On routine, on the quiet assumption that what you see is all there is. You step into an elevator, press a button, and trust the number that lights up. You don't question the space between floors. You don't question the silence in the walls. But I've always had a habit of looking where I'm not supposed to. It started with a scan, an archived blueprint from 1926 that I wasn't meant to access. The building management keeps a sanitized digital model for tenants and inspectors, something clean and predictable, stripped of inconsistencies. I found that version first. 12 floors, a rooftop access level, standard load-bearing structure, nothing unusual. The kind of layout you could memorize in a glance. Then I found the original. It wasn't even labeled properly. Just a series of brittle, yellowed scans tucked deep in a municipal archive database, tagged under an outdated registry code. The resolution was poor, the ink faded, but the details were there if you stared long enough. Hand-drawn annotations, measurements written in careful script, corrections scratched out and rewritten, and something else. At first, it looked like a smudge, a distortion in the vertical spacing between what was labeled the 12th and 14th floors. I thought it was a scanning error, a warping of the page. But when I zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, overlaid it against the modern digital schematic, the gap remained 0.4 feet, not a full level. Not enough space for a floor anyone would recognize. Just a narrow, compressed void that existed in the original plans, but had been completely erased from every modern record. I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at both versions side by side. The modern interface was too clean, too certain. It presented reality like a finished product. But the older plans, they felt unfinished. Like something had been changed midway through construction and never properly resolved, or never meant to be seen. I told myself it was nothing. A drafting error, maybe. A miscalculation corrected during construction. Buildings evolve. Plans change. Space gets redistributed. But that explanation didn't hold up when I went looking for it in the physical structure. The stairwell was the first place I checked. It's one of the few parts of a building where the raw framework still shows through, where the illusion of finished space gives way to something more honest. Concrete walls, exposed steel, the kind of place most tenants avoid unless they have to. I started counting steps. From 12 to 14, the climb should have been consistent with every other transition in the building. Same number of steps, same vertical rise. I'd walked it enough times to know the rhythm without thinking. But that day, I counted carefully, 0.1 step at a time. Slow, deliberate. By the time I reached what should have been the landing for the 13th floor, the one that didn't exist, I stopped. Because the numbers didn't add up, there were too many steps. Not by much. Just enough to feel wrong. Just enough that, when I turned and looked back down the stairwell, the distance seemed stretched. Subtly distorted, like perspective had been pulled tighter than it should be. I almost convinced myself it was in my head. Until I saw the steel. There's a section of the stairwell between 12 and 14 where the concrete isn't perfectly sealed. A narrow vertical seam runs along the wall, exposing part of the building's internal framework. It's easy to miss unless you're looking for imperfections. I was looking. I pressed my flashlight against the gap and angled the beam inside. The structural steel should have followed a predictable pattern. Horizontal beams marking each floor level, evenly spaced, aligned with the steps. That's how buildings are built. That's how they stay stable. But here, the pattern broke. Between the 12th and 14th floor beams, there was an additional segment. Compressed, tighter than the rest. Not aligned with any visible landing or doorway. Just a narrow band of steel that existed where no floor should have been. 0.4 feet. Exactly what the blueprint had shown. I remember feeling this slow, creeping tension settle in my chest. Not fear, not yet. something more technical, like solving a problem that shouldn't exist. Because this wasn't just an oversight. You don't accidentally build extra space into a structure like this. You don't misplace load-bearing steel by 4 feet and then just forget about it. Every inch of a building is accounted for, calculated, reinforced. Unless it isn't meant to be accounted for, that's when I started looking at the elevator. The digital interface doesn't allow for mistakes. It's programmed, controlled, locked into a system that defines where the elevator can and cannot stop. 12. 14. No option in between. No hidden buttons. No gaps. But systems like that are only as reliable as their sensors. That I didn't come up with the idea immediately. It took a few days of going back and forth between the stairwell and the blueprints, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew should be there. The more I looked, the less it made sense. And the less it made sense, the more certain I became that the space was real. The question wasn't whether it existed. The question was how to reach it. Elevators don't think in terms of floors the way we do. They rely on positional data, magnetic sensors, encoders, calibration points that tell the system where the cabin is along the shaft. The floor numbers are just labels assigned to those positions, which means if you can interfere with the sensor, you can interfere with the labels. That I didn't need to reprogram anything. I just needed to confuse it. There's a maintenance panel on the roof access level that connects directly to the elevator's positioning system. It's not exactly hidden, but it's not something tenants are supposed to touch. A small metal box with a locked cover and a set of diagnostic ports inside. The lock was old. Older than the digital system it protected. That IT didn't take much to open. Inside, the wiring was surprisingly simple. Redundant systems layered over older hardware, patches on top of patches, decades of updates without a full replacement. I traced the line connected to the positional encoder, the component responsible for tracking the elevator's vertical movement. All I needed to do was introduce a delay, not enough to trigger a fault, just enough to shift the system's perception of where the cabin was at any given moment. That I wired in a small resistor. Crude, but effective. Something that would cause the sensor to lag slightly behind the actual movement of the elevator. Then I waited. That I didn't try it immediately. I wanted to be sure. I went back to the stairwell, counted the steps again, checked the steel, compared everything one more time to the blueprint. Every detail lined up too perfectly to ignore. The gap was real, and now, theoretically, I had a way to stop inside it. The next night, I took the elevator up to 12. My hand hovered over the panel for a second longer than it should have. It's strange how something as simple as pressing a button can feel different when you know you're about to break a system that was never meant to be broken. I pressed 14. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. At first, everything felt normal. The same quiet hum, the same steady motion. The numbers above the door shifted from 12 to 13. No, that's not right. There is no 13. The display flickered. For a fraction of a second, the number glitched. Not a full change, just a distortion. Like the system couldn't decide what to show. And then, the elevator slowed. Not at 14. Before it, the motion changed subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A slight deceleration where there shouldn't have been one. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were expecting it. My pulse started to pick up. Because the math was working, the sensor delay was enough. The system thought the elevator had reached a valid stopping point. Not 12, not 14, something in between, something it wasn't programmed to name. The cabin shuddered gently as it came to a stop. That NO chime, NO indicator. Just silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft mechanical click, the doors began to open, and there was no light waiting on the other side. The doors didn't open all the way. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the darkness beyond them, not the absence of light or sound, but the way the elevator hesitated, as if something on the other side was resisting. The panel slid apart just enough to create a narrow gap. then stalled with a low, strained hum that vibrated through the metal beneath my feet. I waited. For a second, I thought the system might correct itself, force the doors shut, resume the climb, pretend none of this had happened. But the hum faded instead, settling into a quiet, mechanical tension that never quite resolved. The gap stayed open, just wide enough for me to see into the space beyond. It wasn't a hallway. Not immediately. What I could make out looked more like a vestibule, unfinished, raw, and entirely unlit. The beam from my flashlight cut into it at an angle, illuminating a section of bare concrete wall no more than a few feet across before dissolving into shadow. There were no fixtures, no signage, no indication that this space had ever been intended for occupants. It looked sealed. Or at least, it had been. I pressed my hand against the door and forced it open the rest of the way. The resistance increased for a moment, the mechanism protesting with a strained metallic groan, and then it gave. The panel slid apart just enough for me to step through. The threshold between the elevator and the hidden space, marked only by a thin strip of worn metal beneath my shoes. The air changed immediately. Elevators have a certain neutrality to them. Filtered, recycled, controlled. This wasn't that. The air in the vestibule felt heavier, denser, like it had been sitting undisturbed for years. There was a smell, too. Not decay, not exactly. Something mineral. Damp concrete mixed with something faintly organic, like soil after rain, but stripped of anything living. I turned back briefly, half expecting the doors to close behind me the moment I stepped out. They didn't. They remained open, frozen in that same incomplete position, the interior light of the cabin spilling weakly into the darkness like it didn't belong there. I took a step forward, then another. The beam of my flashlight widened across the floor, revealing a narrow rectangular space, maybe 6 feet deep, enclosed on 3 sides by reinforced concrete. The walls were smooth but unfinished, the surface marked with subtle imperfections where the material had settled unevenly during curing. There were no seams, no visible entry points beyond the elevator itself. It felt less like a room and more like a gap, a space that existed because something else had been forced around it. I crouched slightly, running the light along the base of the walls, looking for anything that might explain how this area had been constructed or why it had been hidden. That's when I saw the second layer. Behind the concrete, it wasn't obvious at first. Just a faint irregularity in the surface, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed as a flaw in the material. But when I shifted the angle of the flashlight, the texture changed. There was a difference in density, a barely perceptible variation in the way the light reflected. Something was embedded behind the wall. Or built over. I set the flashlight down on the floor and reached into my bag, pulling out the thermal camera. It wasn't professional grade, but it was enough to detect basic heat variations, enough to confirm whether there was anything active behind the concrete. For a moment, I hesitated. Up until now, everything had been structural, measurable. Even the anomaly in the stairwell had a kind of cold logic to it. A discrepancy you could document, analyze, eventually explain. This felt different. Still, I powered the camera on. The screen flickered to life, rendering the world in gradients of color, cool blues and purples dominating the scene, the ambient temperature of the concrete registering as a uniform, lifeless field. I aimed it at the wall. At first, there was nothing, just the same cold uniformity, the same flat distribution of temperature across the surface. I adjusted the sensitivity, narrowed the range, focused on a smaller section directly in front of me, and then I saw it. A shift, faint but distinct. A patch of warmer color emerging beneath the surface, diffused and irregular, like heat bleeding through layers of insulation. It wasn't static. It moved, subtly, slowly, but undeniably. Expanding, contracting. I held the camera steady, my grip tightening without me realizing it. The pattern wasn't random. It followed a rhythm, a consistent cycle of motion that repeated with unnerving precision. Inhale, exhale, the realization hit before I could stop it. The pattern matched a human respiratory rate. I lowered the camera slightly, then raised it again, as if changing the angle might change what I was seeing. It didn't. The movement remained, steady and deliberate, the heat signature pulsing behind the reinforced drywall, like something was breathing on the other side. That's when I heard it first. It was too quiet to register as anything more than background noise. A faint vibration at the edge of perception, easy to ignore if you weren't listening for it. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. A low, rhythmic sound. Not quite a hum. Not quite a scrape. Something in between. I pressed my hand against the wall. The vibration intensified instantly, traveling through the concrete and into my palm. It wasn't strong enough to shake the structure, but it was consistent, patterned in the same slow cycle as the heat signature on the camera. Inhale, exhale, the sound followed it perfectly. A soft, dragging texture layered beneath the rhythm, like something moving just out of reach. Not walking, not shifting in a way I could easily define. More like a continuous contact, something brushing against the inside of the wall with each cycle of motion. I pulled my hand back. The silence that followed felt wrong, even though the sound hadn't stopped. It was still there, still vibrating through the space, but my awareness of it had changed. It wasn't background anymore. It was the dominant presence in the room, and it was coming from all sides. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the remaining walls. The beam caught the same subtle irregularities in the concrete, the same suggestion of something layered beneath the surface. I raised the thermal camera again, scanning the perimeter. Every wall responded, not identically, but enough to confirm the pattern. Multiple heat signatures, overlapping slightly, each one pulsing at the same steady interval. Not synchronized perfectly, but close enough that the effect blended into a single, unified rhythm, like lungs, plural. I took a step back toward the elevator, the instinct to retreat building faster than I could justify it. This was already more than I'd expected to find, more than I could easily explain. But the door was still open, and the light from the cabin, weak as it was, felt like the only stable thing in the space. I reached for it without looking, keeping my eyes on the wall as I moved. That's when the vibration changed. It didn't stop. It deepened. The frequency shifted lower, the rhythm slowing just slightly, enough to disrupt the pattern I'd been tracking. The heat signatures on the camera responded immediately, the expansion phase lasting longer, the contraction more pronounced. Something had noticed. The thought came uninvited, fully formed, and I couldn't push it away. I froze in place. The sound intensified again, the faint scraping layer becoming more distinct, more deliberate. It no longer felt like background motion. It felt directed, focused, toward me. I forced myself to move, taking another step back, then another, until my heel hit the threshold of the elevator. The moment my weight shifted onto the metal strip, the vibration dropped, not gradually, instantly. The heat signatures on the camera collapsed inward, the pulsing motion halting mid-cycle. The sound cut off so cleanly it left a pressure in my ears, like the absence of it was just as loud as its presence had been. I stood there, half in the elevator, half in the vestibule, staring at the wall. Nothing moved. Nothing pulsed. The space returned to the same cold, inert stillness it had when I first entered. But the camera was still in my hand, and on the screen, just for a moment, just long enough to register before it faded. One of the heat signatures didn't disappear completely. It shifted, sliding laterally behind the wall, too smoothly to match the earlier pattern, too precisely to be random, repositioning, closer to where I stood. I should have left, standing there with one foot inside the elevator and the other still touching that hidden space. Everything in me was telling me to stop. I had already confirmed enough, more than enough. A concealed gap between floors. Heat signatures that behaved like breathing. Movement behind reinforced walls that responded to my presence. That should have been the end of it, but the door stayed open, and the silence on the other side of the vestibule felt expectant, not empty, not abandoned, waiting. That I don't remember making the decision to keep going. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like momentum. Like once you start pulling at something that doesn't make sense, you can't stop until it either breaks or you do. Instead of stepping back into the elevator, I turned, fully, and faced the far wall of the vestibule again. Up close, the concrete didn't look as solid as it had from a distance. The surface imperfections I'd noticed earlier formed a faint outline now that I knew what to look for. An almost rectangular seam, slightly darker than the surrounding material, just large enough to suggest an access point that had been sealed over rather than constructed as a permanent barrier. That I ran my fingers along it. The texture changed subtly under my hand. The edges weren't clean. They had been filled in after the fact, patched with a slightly different mixture that hadn't bonded perfectly with the original pour. This wasn't part of the initial design. It was something that had been closed. I pressed harder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a dull, brittle crack, a thin section of the surface gave way beneath the pressure. Not enough to open anything fully, just enough to break the illusion of a continuous wall. The sound echoed more than it should have, not outward, but inward, as if the space behind the concrete was larger than it had any right to be. I froze, listening, in no immediate response. No return of the vibrations, no shift in the air, just that same heavy stillness. I widened the opening carefully, chipping away at the weakened section until the hole was large enough to see through. The beam of my flashlight slipped inside, cutting across a narrow void that extended beyond the thickness of the wall, and then it kept going. Further than it should have. I leaned in, angling the light deeper, trying to find the opposite surface. There wasn't one. Instead, the beam revealed the edge of a corridor, an actual hallway, running parallel to the vestibule, but completely hidden from the building's visible structure. The walls inside were different. Not concrete, not modern, something older. I widened the gap just enough to squeeze through. The transition was immediate. One step forward, and the air shifted again, drier this time, but heavier in a different way. The mineral dampness of the vestibule gave way to something more aged, more stagnant. The smell changed with it. Dust, decay, and the faint trace of something that had been sealed away for too long. I turned back instinctively. The hole in the concrete looked smaller from this side. Not physically smaller, but less defined. Like the edges had softened, the boundary between spaces becoming less certain the moment I crossed it. I forced myself to focus forward. The hallway stretched out in both directions, narrow and uneven, with a ceiling that sat lower than the floors above it should have allowed. The flashlight beam revealed walls made of lath and plaster, thin wooden slats beneath a brittle, crumbling surface that had cracked and warped over time. This wasn't part of the modern building. This was original or older. The transition between materials wasn't gradual. There was no blending, no attempt to integrate the old with the new. It was abrupt, almost violent, as if the concrete had been poured directly against this pre-existing structure, sealing it off without removing it, like something had been built around it. I took a slow step forward, then another. The floor creaked under my weight, the sound sharp and intrusive in the confined space. Dust shifted in the beam of the flashlight, suspended particles catching the light before settling again into stillness. The corridor didn't feel stable, not structurally. Spatially, the perspective was wrong. I stopped after a few steps and pulled a measuring tape from my bag, anchoring it at the edge of the breach in the wall. It felt absurd in the moment, trying to quantify something that already defied basic logic. But I needed something concrete, something measurable, something real. I extended the tape along the length of the hallway, keeping it taut as I moved forward. 10 feet, 15, 20. The corridor kept going. I glanced back over my shoulder. The distance to the opening hadn't changed, not in the way it should have. It looked compressed, like the space behind me had been shortened without affecting the space ahead. I turned forward again, continuing to extend the tape. 30 feet, 40. Yet the exterior footprint of the building couldn't support this. I checked. The dimensions didn't allow for a corridor of this length between the stairwell and the outer wall. There wasn't enough space. Not physically, not mathematically. And yet, 50 feet. The tape ran out before the hallway did. I stopped, staring down at it, trying to process what that meant. The building, as it existed on every official record, couldn't contain this. The space I was standing in exceeded its boundaries, which meant one of two things. Either the records were wrong, or the space wasn't obeying them. A faint sound pulled my attention back to the present, not the rhythmic vibration from before. Something lighter, more fragile. Paper. I followed it instinctively, the beam of my flashlight sweeping along the walls until it caught on something irregular near the baseboard. A small recess where the plaster had broken away, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Inside, there was a bundle, wrapped in what looked like cloth, discolored with age, edges frayed and brittle. I crouched carefully, reaching in and pulling it free. The material disintegrated slightly under my touch, releasing a thin cloud of dust that hung in the air before settling. Inside the wrapping were papers, old, fragile, handwritten. I unfolded them slowly, careful not to tear what little structure remained. The ink had faded, but it was still legible in places, tight, precise handwriting that matched the style I'd seen in the original blueprints. Maintenance logs. Dated 1926. I felt a chill run through me as I read the first few lines. Routine entries at first, inspections, minor repairs, notes on structural adjustments. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained the space I was standing in. Until the tone changed, the handwriting became less consistent, more hurried, lines crossed out and rewritten, annotations crammed into the margins as if the writer had been trying to keep up with something that wasn't staying still. I turned to the final page, the last entry. The ink was darker there, pressed deeper into the paper as if written with more force. The sentence started clearly enough, structural variance increasing beyond acceptable. It stopped, not at the end of a line, not at the end of a thought. Mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing off into nothing, as if the writer had been interrupted in the middle of writing it. Or pulled away. I stared at it longer than I should have, waiting for something, some explanation to emerge from the silence around me. But the hallway didn't respond. It just stretched on, quiet, unfinished, like whatever had started here in 1926 had never actually ended. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until the silence started to feel too loud. The hallway had that effect. It absorbed sound in a way that made every small movement feel amplified, like the space itself was listening back. Even the faint crackle of the old paper in my hand seemed intrusive, out of place. I folded the maintenance logs carefully and slid them into my bag, not because I thought they'd be useful anymore, but because leaving them behind felt wrong, like abandoning evidence in a place that didn't want to be documented. The scratching started again a few seconds later, not behind me this time. Ahead. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo the way it should have in a corridor this narrow. It stayed low, close to the walls, like it was traveling through them rather than across the air. A thin, dragging texture layered over something deeper, something that pulsed just beneath the threshold of hearing. I stood still, letting it settle into something I could track. There was a pattern to it, not random movement, not the erratic noise of something trapped and trying to escape. This was controlled, repetitive, almost deliberate. That I reached into my bag again and pulled out the contact microphone. It was a simple device, just a small sensor designed to pick up vibrations through solid surfaces, paired with a set of headphones. I'd brought it as a precaution, not really expecting to use it. Up until now, everything I'd encountered had been visible, measurable through conventional means. That assumption was starting to feel naive. I pressed the sensor gently against the nearest section of exposed framework where the plaster had cracked away, revealing a strip of structural beam beneath. The metal felt colder than it should have been, the temperature difference noticeable even through the thin casing of the device. That I slipped the headphones on. At first, there was nothing. Just a faint, static hiss. The baseline noise of the system amplifying whatever minimal vibration existed in the beam. I adjusted the sensitivity, increasing the gain slightly, and waited. Then it came through, louder than I expected. The scratching, not muffled like it had been through the air, but sharp and immediate, each movement transmitted directly through the metal into the sensor. It wasn't a single point of contact. It moved, sliding along the beam in short, controlled bursts, pausing, then continuing in a different direction, tracing something. I followed it instinctively, keeping the sensor pressed to the beam as I moved down the corridor. The sound shifted with me, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading, but always staying just ahead of where I stood, like it was guiding me. Or avoiding me. The deeper I went, the stronger the underlying vibration became. It wasn't as rhythmic as what I'd felt in the vestibule, but it shared the same quality: low frequency, steady, something that seemed less like a mechanical function and more like a biological process translated into structure. The beam beneath my hand began to tremble slightly, not visibly, but enough that I could feel it through the microphone casing. A faint oscillation that matched the deeper tone in the headphones. The scratching layered over it, weaving in and out of the rhythm like something moving through a current. I stopped when the sound peaked. The shift was immediate. One step forward, and the scratching intensified, sharper, closer, no longer traveling along the beam, but concentrated in a single point directly in front of me. I lowered the headphones slowly. The sound was audible even without them now. A faint, persistent scraping coming from the wall to my right. I turned the flashlight toward it. First glance, it looked like every other section of the corridor. Aged plaster, cracked and uneven. The surface broken in places where the underlying lath had begun to show through. But there was something different here. The cracks weren't random. They formed a loose outline. A rectangular shape similar to the one I'd found in the vestibule, but smaller. More defined, an access panel. Hidden, but not sealed as completely. I stepped closer. The low-frequency hum I'd been tracking through the beam was stronger here, radiating outward from behind the wall. It wasn't just a sound. It was a pressure, subtle but constant, like standing too close to a large piece of machinery. Except there was no machinery here. I raised the camera and pointed it at the panel. The lens struggled to focus. At first, I thought it was a lighting issue, the beam of the flashlight creating too much contrast for the sensor to adjust properly. But as I moved the camera slightly, the distortion followed, not tied to the light, but to the space itself. The edges of the panel wavered, not visibly to the eye, but through the camera. The lines bent and shifted as if the air between the lens and the wall was vibrating at a frequency the device couldn't compensate for. The hum deepened. The scratching stopped completely. The silence that replaced it felt intentional. I reached out and placed my hand against the panel. The vibrations surged, stronger than anything I'd felt so far, the energy behind the wall pushing back against my palm in a steady, unbroken wave. It didn't fluctuate like the earlier patterns. It held, constant, alive. I pulled my hand away and used the edge of the flashlight to press against one of the cracks. The plaster gave slightly, brittle from age, and with a bit more pressure, a section of it broke loose, falling inward with a dull, hollow sound. The opening revealed darkness, not empty darkness. Depth. I widened the gap carefully, breaking away more of the weakened material until I could angle the flashlight inside. What it revealed didn't make sense at first, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was. The space behind the panel wasn't a corridor. It wasn't a room. It was a network, tight, irregular, filled with the building's internal systems. Electrical conduits, bundled wiring, old piping that ran in parallel lines through the structure. Except they weren't alone. Something else was there, threaded between them. At first, I thought it was insulation, some kind of outdated material that had degraded over time, expanding into the available space. But as the light shifted, the texture changed. It wasn't uniform. It branched. Thin, fibrous strands weaving through the conduits, wrapping around the wiring in complex patterns that followed the paths of the building's infrastructure. Some sections were thicker, clustered together in dense knots, while others stretched out in long, tapering lines that disappeared deeper into the network. They looked like roots, but not the kind that grow in soil. These were embedded in the building itself, integrated into its systems in a way that suggested they hadn't just grown around the structure, they had grown with it. The flashlight beam caught a section where the strands intersected with an exposed electrical line. The insulation around the wire had been breached, not cut or torn, but absorbed, replaced by the same fibrous material that now pulsed faintly with that low, constant hum. I leaned closer, trying to get a better look. The hum intensified, and for a brief moment, I saw it. Movement. Not the slow, rhythmic expansion from before. Something faster. A ripple traveling along one of the strands, passing through the network in a fraction of a second before disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the light. I jerked back instinctively. The reaction immediate and uncontrollable. The hum dropped slightly. Not gone, but diminished. Like whatever had moved had retreated. Or settled. I stood there, staring into the opening, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I understood about how buildings function. Electrical systems don't pulse, conduits don't grow, and whatever this was, it wasn't just inside the walls. It was part of them, feeding through the structure, following every line, every connection, every floor, including the ones that weren't supposed to exist. I didn't run. That's the part one keep coming back to when I review the footage. I should have. Every instinct, every rational conclusion pointed to the same outcome. Leave, get out, don't come back. But when I finally stepped back through the breach, through the vestibule, and into the elevator, I wasn't thinking about escape. I was thinking about proof. The doors didn't resist me this time. They slid shut with a clean, mechanical finality, sealing the space behind me as if it had never been there at all. The panel above flickered once, just once, before stabilizing on 14, and the elevator resumed its ascent like nothing had happened. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were still shaking. Not from fear, from anticipation. I transferred the footage immediately. Every second I'd recorded, from the blueprint comparisons to the breach, the hallway, the panel, the structures inside the walls. I needed to see it again, needed to confirm that what I'd experienced hadn't been distorted by the environment, by adrenaline, by expectation. The first few clips were exactly as I remembered, the blueprints aligned. The stairwell gap was visible. The elevator glitch, subtle, but there. Enough to suggest something outside normal operation. The vestibule footage held, too. The thermal signatures pulsing behind the concrete. The rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched a breathing pattern. Even knowing what I'd see, it still felt wrong watching it play back on a screen. But it was real, documented, measurable. I kept going. The hallway footage was where things started to break. At first, it looked stable. The lath and plaster walls, the narrow corridor stretching ahead, the measuring tape extending across the floor. Everything matched my memory, until I let the clip run longer than I had the first time. In the background, something shifted, not abruptly, gradually, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible unless you were watching for it. The far end of the corridor moved. It didn't change shape. It didn't distort in a way that could be easily explained as a camera artifact. It simply receded. The distance between me and the end of the hallway increased over time. Even though I wasn't moving, I paused the video, rewound it, played it again. The effect was consistent, frame by frame. The space elongated. The measuring tape on the floor didn't change. The walls didn't bend or warp. But the endpoint, whatever defined the limit of that corridor, was shifting backward, extending the space beyond what had already been impossible. I checked the metadata in dropped frames. No digital anomalies. The timestamps were consistent, which meant the movement wasn't in the recording. It was in the space itself. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, trying to process what that implied. A corridor that exceeded the building's external dimensions. A space that could expand without altering its internal structure. Something that didn't just exist outside the blueprint, but actively defied it. That's when I pulled up the city records. I don't know why I hadn't checked them earlier. Maybe I assumed they'd match the modern schematics, the sanitized version of the building's layout that I'd already seen. 12 floors. Standard construction. No anomalies. But this time, I went deeper. Older registries. Archived permits. Construction logs that hadn't been digitized cleanly. Records that still carried the inconsistencies of being transferred from paper to system without full verification. And then, nothing. Not missing entries. Not redacted sections. Absence. Every reference to the original construction beyond a certain point in 1926 simply stopped. The project was listed as completed, signed off, finalized, but the supporting documentation wasn't there. No inspection reports for the upper levels. No structural amendments. No revisions explaining the changes between the original blueprints and the final recorded design. It was as if the building had been finished without being built or completed without being recorded. I cross-referenced everything. Multiple databases. Different archives. Private records where I could access them. The result was always the same. A clean, uninterrupted history that only existed because everything that contradicted it had been removed. Deliberately. I went back to the footage one more time. Not the hallway. Not the panel. The section inside the wall. The network. I slowed it down, frame by frame, focusing on the moment where the light caught the strands wrapped around the electrical conduit. The point where the insulation ended and something else began. The hum I'd heard in that space, the low, constant vibration, it wasn't random. It followed the same pathways as the building's power grid, intertwined with every system that kept the structure functional. Lighting, elevators, water, heat. All of it routed through the same network I'd seen behind that panel. I muted the audio and just watched, the subtle pulsing along the strands, the way they responded to movement, the way they connected everything. And for the first time since this started, I stopped thinking about what the 13th floor was and started thinking about what it was doing. Because buildings don't breathe, they don't grow, they don't adjust their internal dimensions in real time. But this one does, which means the question isn't why the 13th floor was hidden. It's not even how it exists. The question is, if every system in this building runs through that space, then what exactly is keeping it alive, and what happens if it ever stops?